Please. My sister has a high fever, sir. The billionaire almost kept walking. Snow fell in thick, silent sheets over downtown Chicago, dusting the sidewalks, and black SUVs in a cold, white hush that made the city feel distant and untouchable. Daniel Whitmore adjusted the cuff of his tailored wool coat as he stepped out of the heated glow of the charity gala, the kind of event where people pledged 6 figures under crystal chandeliers and forgot about it before dessert. The wind cut sharp across the street, biting through fabric and ego alike, and that was when he saw her, a small figure beneath the flickering light of a closed pharmacy sign no more than 4 feet tall, thin sneakers soaked through with slush. She was clutching a little girl wrapped in a faded pink blanket, holding her so tightly it looked as if letting go might shatter something fragile in the world. The younger child's cheeks were flushed, her breathing shallow, her head resting against her sister's shoulder as if the weight of it was too much to carry alone. Daniel slowed without meaning to. He had built an empire by never slowing down. Emily Carter's eyes were a pale winter blue, steady and pleading, but not dramatic, not loud, just desperate in a way that felt honest. She's been sick for 2 days, she whispered, her voice trembling more from the cold than fear. Traffic lights changed. Drivers honked. Somewhere a siren wailed in the distance, swallowed by the storm. Daniel felt the old instinct to look away, to assume there was a system for this, a shelter, a hotline, someone else's responsibility. Yet something in the way the little girl's fingers clutched her sister's coat sleeve tightened around his chest, like a memory he had tried for years to bury. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel Whitmore did not take another step forward. Daniel Whitmore told himself it was the wind that kept him rooted to the sidewalk, but he knew it was not the weather. It was the way the older girl stood between her sister and the world, as if 9 years of life had already taught her that no one else would. He glanced at the glowing entrance of the hotel behind him, where valet attendants waited beside polished cars worth more than most houses in Chicago, then back at the 2 small figures beneath the dim light. The younger child shifted slightly in her sister's arms, a faint sound escaping her lips. Not a cry, just a tired breath that did not sound right. Daniel stepped closer, his shoes crunching against salt and ice. Up close, he could see how thin the girl's coat was, how her fingers were red from the cold, how carefully she held her sister's head to keep it steady. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice quieter than he expected. "Emily," she answered. "And this is Lily. She is 5. 5 years old." Daniel imagined a kindergarten classroom. Bright posters, warm lunches, nap time on soft mats. Not a freezing sidewalk on State Street at nearly 11 o'clock at night, with temperatures hovering just above 15 degrees Fahrenheit. He asked where their parents were, and Emily's jaw tightened in a way that did not belong on a child's face. "Our mom passed away in October," she said. "We do not have anyone else." The city moved around them, indifferent and fast, but Daniel felt time slow to a heavy, uncomfortable pause. He had written checks inside that ballroom that would never change his life. Yet standing here, he sensed that the next decision he made just might. Daniel felt the familiar instinct to calculate, to measure risk and liability the way he did in boardrooms, but nothing about this moment fit into numbers. Emily shifted Lily higher against her shoulder, straining under the weight, yet refusing to let her slip even an inch. The child's forehead rested against her sister's cheek, and Daniel could see the shine of heat on pale skin that should have been cool in this weather. "Have you seen a doctor?" he asked carefully. Emily shook her head. "We tried a clinic, but they said we needed insurance. I have been giving her water." She said she was cold, even inside. The words were simple, spoken without accusation, yet they landed heavily. Daniel imagined an apartment somewhere in the city, lights turned off, cupboards thinning out. A little girl counting dollars in a jar while her sister lay on a couch, burning with fever. He remembered signing budget cuts 3 months ago, restructuring health benefits in one of his subsidiary companies, to stabilize quarterly losses. It had been strategic, necessary, clean. He had not pictured faces. He had not pictured this. A gust of wind swept down the block, and Lily stirred weakly, her small hand clutching the front of Emily's coat. That fragile grip pierced something deep in him, a memory of another winter long ago, when he had stood in a hospital hallway helpless and too late to change what had already been decided. He exhaled slowly, the air visible in the cold. "You cannot stay out here," he said at last, and for the first time that night, his voice carried something other than authority. It carried urgency. Emily's eyes narrowed slightly, not with defiance but with caution, as if she had learned that offers often came with conditions. Daniel could see the calculation behind her silence. She was measuring him the way adults measured strangers searching for signs of danger in a man whose watch alone could have paid a year of rent. Snow gathered along Lily's thin blanket, melting against the heat of her fever. Daniel removed his coat without thinking and draped it carefully over both girls, the heavy wool swallowing their small frames. "My car is right there," he said, nodding toward the black SUV idling under the streetlight. "It is warm. We can take your sister somewhere safe." Emily hesitated. "We cannot pay," she said quietly, almost apologetically. The words struck him harder than any accusation could have. "You do not owe me anything," Daniel replied, and for once he meant it without calculation. Lily's breathing hitched softly, and her head rolled slightly against Emily's shoulder. That fragile movement ended the debate. Daniel stepped forward and gently lifted Lily into his own arms. She weighed almost nothing, far too light for a 5-year-old. The heat of her skin radiated through his shirt, startling against the winter air. Emily walked beside him close enough that her sleeve brushed his coat, as if she feared being separated even by inches. The driver moved to open the rear door, surprise flashing across his face at the sight of 2 snow-covered children. Daniel did not offer explanation. He slid into the back seat and motioned for Emily to climb in beside him. Warm air rushed around them, fogging the windows. For a brief second, the world outside disappeared into white. Daniel looked down at Lily, resting against his chest. Her small hand curled weakly into the fabric of his shirt, and he realized this was no longer a moment he could walk away from. This was a line, and he had just crossed it. The SUV pulled away from the curb, tires hissing over wet pavement as downtown lights blurred into streaks of gold against the snow-covered windshield. Inside the vehicle, the heat wrapped around them, carrying the faint scent of leather and cedar. Lily stirred again, her breath uneven against Daniel's chest, and he adjusted his hold instinctively, one hand supporting her back, the way he had once done long ago in a hospital room he tried not to remember. Emily sat stiffly beside him, her hands clasped together so tightly her knuckles turned pale. She watched every movement he made, not with trust, but with vigilance. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Northwestern Memorial," Daniel replied. "It is 10 minutes from here if traffic cooperates." He tapped lightly on the privacy glass. "Please take Lakeshore Drive." The driver nodded and accelerated smoothly. Outside, the wind pushed snow in restless spirals across the road, and the temperature display on the dashboard read 14 degrees Fahrenheit. Daniel felt a flicker of anger at the thought of 2 children standing in that cold, while hundreds of people toasted champagne less than a block away. "How long have you been outside tonight?" he asked gently. "Since this afternoon," Emily answered. "Our landlord changed the locks. I did not know where else to go." The words were steady, almost adult, but her voice cracked at the edges. Daniel looked down at Lily again, at the small crease between her brows, as if even in sleep she felt discomfort. "She started shaking earlier," Emily added. Then she got very quiet. That detail tightened something inside him. Quiet was not always a good sign. The city skyline opened up along the lake, tall buildings glowing against the storm, and Daniel felt the weight of every decision he had ever made pressing into this single ride. For years, he had believed distance kept him efficient. Tonight, distance felt like failure. And as the hospital entrance came into view, bright and waiting, he knew there was no returning to the man he had been just an hour ago. The SUV came to a smooth stop beneath the bright canopy of the emergency entrance, where automatic doors slid open and closed in steady rhythm against the storm. Warm, fluorescent light spilled onto the snow, turning it into a pale silver glow. Daniel stepped out first, holding Lily securely against his chest as the cold air rushed back around them. Emily followed close behind her small boots, slipping slightly on the wet pavement before she steadied herself. Inside, the scent of antiseptic and clean air replaced the sharp bite of winter. A triage nurse looked up from the desk, her expression shifting instantly when she saw the child in Daniel's arms. "High fever," Daniel said clearly. "She has been exposed to freezing temperatures for several hours." The nurse moved quickly, guiding them toward a set of double doors, while another staff member rolled over a small wheelchair. Lily's eyes fluttered open for a brief second, unfocused and glassy, before closing again. Emily reached out and touched her sister's hand. "I am right here," she whispered. Daniel felt that whisper echo through him. Forms were placed in his hand, questions about insurance and guardianship rising in efficient, practiced tones. He did not hesitate. "Bill everything to me," he said, giving his full name. The reaction was subtle but noticeable, a flicker of recognition crossing the clerk's face. Within moments, a pediatric team surrounded Lily, checking her temperature, listening to her breathing, moving with calm urgency. Emily stood frozen until a nurse gently guided her to a chair nearby and wrapped a warm blanket around her shoulders. Daniel remained where he was told to stand, hands suddenly empty, feeling the absence of the small weight he had carried only seconds before. Through the partially open curtain, he could see doctors adjusting monitors, hear soft instructions spoken in measured voices. No chaos, no panic, just controlled focus. Yet his heartbeat felt anything but controlled. He had faced hostile takeovers and billion-dollar negotiations without blinking. Now he found himself staring at a thin hospital curtain, waiting for a stranger to tell him whether a 5-year-old girl he had met less than an hour ago would be all right. And for the first time in years, the outcome felt deeply personal. Minutes stretched into something heavier than time as Daniel stood just outside the treatment area, watching silhouettes move behind the curtain. The steady beep of a monitor rose and fell in calm rhythm, yet each sound felt amplified in his chest. Emily sat a few feet away, wrapped in a hospital blanket that nearly swallowed her frame, her wet hair beginning to dry in uneven strands around her face. She had not cried. She had not asked for food or water. She simply stared at the curtain as if willing it to open. Daniel walked to the vending machines and returned with a bottle of water and a small package of crackers. He knelt slightly so he would not tower over her. "You need to eat something," he said gently. She hesitated, then accepted the crackers with quiet politeness. Her hands trembled, whether from cold or fear he could not tell. "Is she going to be all right?" she asked without looking at him. Daniel paused. He had built a career on confident answers, on forecasts and guarantees backed by data. This question had no spreadsheet. "They are doing everything they can," he said carefully. "And we brought her here in time." Emily nodded once, absorbing the words, as if storing them for strength. A doctor finally stepped out, removing his gloves and offering a professional but measured expression. "She has a high fever of 103 degrees Fahrenheit, he explained. "There are signs of pneumonia. We are starting antibiotics and fluids immediately. The next few hours are important." Important. The word landed like a quiet warning. Daniel felt Emily's small fingers grip the edge of his sleeve. He did not pull away. "Can I see her?" she asked. The doctor smiled softly. "One at a time." Daniel gestured for Emily to go first. As she disappeared behind the curtain, Daniel remained in the hallway, staring at the polished floor reflecting overhead lights. He told himself this was temporary, that professionals were handling it, that he had done his part. Yet the truth pressed harder with each passing second. For the first time in years, control was not in his hands, and that unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. Daniel remained in the hallway listening to the muted hum of the hospital at nearly midnight, the distant roll of a cart, the soft murmur of nurses changing shifts. Through a narrow gap in the curtain, he could see Emily climb carefully onto the edge of the hospital bed, her small hand wrapping around Lily's fingers, as if anchoring her to this world. Lily lay against white sheets that looked too large for her, an oxygen tube resting gently beneath her nose, her chest rising in shallow but steadier movements than before. Emily leaned close and whispered something Daniel could not hear, her forehead nearly touching her sister's. The sight unsettled him in a way boardroom losses never had. After a few minutes, a nurse stepped out and motioned for Daniel to enter while Emily stayed by the bedside. He hesitated at the threshold, suddenly unsure of his place in this sterile room filled with quiet machines and fragile hope. The doctor reviewed the chest X-ray on a small screen and spoke in measured tones. "The infection is significant, but we have started intravenous antibiotics. If her body responds well overnight, she should stabilize. However, she will need to be admitted for observation." Daniel nodded, absorbing each word as if it were a contract clause. "Do whatever is necessary," he said firmly. "There will be no limitations." The doctor studied him for a moment, perhaps recognizing both authority and something softer beneath it. When Daniel stepped closer to the bed, Lily's eyelids fluttered briefly. Her gaze was unfocused, but her fingers tightened faintly around Emily's hand. Emily looked up at Daniel then, and for the first time there was no suspicion in her eyes, only exhaustion and a fragile trust forming at the edges. "She hates hospitals," Emily murmured. "She gets scared." Daniel swallowed. "She is not alone," he answered quietly. Yet as he spoke, he realized the statement applied to more than the little girl in the bed. Something in this room was shifting, rearranging priorities he had once considered immovable, and he could feel it happening with every steady beep from the monitor beside her. The hours past midnight carried a strange stillness, as if the hospital itself was holding its breath. Snow continued to fall outside the tall windows, coating the city in a quiet white that erased the sharp edges of skyscrapers and streetlights. Daniel sat in a rigid chair near Lily's bed, his phone face down in his hand, unread messages stacking up from assistants and board members who had no idea where he was. For the first time in years, he did not care. Emily had finally drifted into a shallow sleep in the recliner beside the bed, still clutching Lily's hand, as if letting go might undo the fragile progress of the night. A nurse adjusted the intravenous line and offered Daniel a reassuring nod. "Her temperature is coming down slightly," she said softly. 102.4 degrees Fahrenheit. Still high but lower. The number felt like a fragile victory. Daniel exhaled slowly, tension easing by inches rather than miles. He stood and walked toward the window, staring at the city he believed he understood. He had built towers, funded startups, reshaped markets. Yet somewhere within that sprawling skyline, 2 children had slipped through every safety net his industry claimed to provide. The thought unsettled him deeply. His mind drifted backward, uninvited, to a hospital room from his own past, to a winter night when he had stood outside another curtain, powerless to stop an illness that moved too fast. He had buried that memory under layers of ambition and acquisition, convincing himself that success could outrun regret. Tonight proved otherwise. A sudden change in the monitor's rhythm pulled his attention back. The steady beeping quickened slightly, not chaotic, but enough to send a jolt through him. Nurses stepped in with calm precision, checking Lily's breathing, adjusting her oxygen flow. Daniel's heart pounded as he watched from the foot of the bed, unable to intervene, forced to trust. Emily stirred awake, eyes wide with fear. "What is happening?" she asked, her voice trembling. Daniel crossed the small distance, instantly kneeling beside her chair so they were eye level. "They are helping her," he said firmly. though uncertainty flickered beneath his calm tone. The next few minutes stretched thin and fragile. Then gradually the monitor steadied once more, returning to its rhythmic reassurance. The nurse offered a small smile. "She is responding," she said. Relief washed over Daniel so suddenly he had to steady himself against the bedrail. He realized then how deeply invested he had become in the outcome of a life he had only just encountered. And as he looked at Emily's tear-filled but hopeful eyes, he understood that this night was no longer about charity. It was about responsibility. By 3 a.m, Lily's fever had lowered to 101 degrees Fahrenheit, and the sharp tension in the room eased into cautious hope. Emily refused to leave her sister's side, even when a nurse offered to bring her to the pediatric lounge for hot chocolate. Daniel watched the quiet devotion between them and felt something unfamiliar settle into his chest, a weight that was not anxiety, but recognition. When the doctor stepped back in to review Lily's chart, Daniel followed him into the hallway for a private conversation. "She should recover," the doctor explained, "but prolonged exposure to cold and delayed treatment made it worse than it needed to be. Worse than it needed to be." The phrase echoed long after the doctor returned to the room. Daniel leaned against the wall, staring at the polished floor beneath fluorescent lights. He thought about the landlord who had changed the locks, about the clinic that had turned them away without insurance, about the invisible chain of decisions that left 2 children standing in 15-degree weather. A quiet question rose in his mind, one he had avoided for years. How many of those chains led back to his own signature? He pulled out his phone at last and searched for the name Emily had mentioned earlier when filling out intake forms. Their mother had worked for a cleaning subcontractor that serviced several of his company's office buildings. He recognized the subsidiary immediately. 6 months ago, during a cost reduction initiative, benefits had been cut and contracts renegotiated. Numbers had improved. Stock prices had climbed. He had praised the efficiency. Now he wondered what those efficiencies had cost in human terms. He felt a tightening in his throat that had nothing to do with fatigue. Inside the room, Emily brushed Lily's hair gently away from her forehead, whispering reassurances in a steady voice that did not match her age. Daniel realized that if their mother had lost health coverage during those changes, a treatable illness could have become a financial impossibility. He had never seen her name. He had never needed to. Decisions were abstract when filtered through layers of management. Tonight stripped away that abstraction. For the first time, Daniel did not see himself as a rescuer stepping in at the right moment. He saw the possibility that he might have been part of the reason intervention was needed at all. And that realization settled heavier than the winter storm still blanketing the city outside. The first pale hint of dawn began to press against the hospital windows, turning the night sky from black to a muted steel gray. Snow still clung to the ledges outside, but the storm had softened into a quiet drift. Inside the room, Lily slept more peacefully, her breathing steadier, the oxygen flow reduced slightly under careful supervision. Emily had not moved from her position beside the bed, though exhaustion weighed heavily on her small shoulders. Daniel stepped back into the room, after another brief conversation with the doctor, carrying 2 cups of warm apple juice he had found in the cafeteria. He handed one to Emily, who accepted it with a whisper of thanks. In the softer light of early morning, she looked younger, the guarded tension easing just enough to reveal the child she still was. "Did your mom work nearby?" Daniel asked gently, keeping his tone casual. Emily nodded. "She cleaned offices downtown. She used to bring home leftover muffins from meetings sometimes. She said the people who worked there were important." The words landed with quiet precision. Daniel felt the weight of them settle into his chest. "Was she sick for long?" he asked carefully. Emily's gaze dropped to the blanket. She had a cough that would not go away. "She kept working because we needed the money. She said insurance got complicated after her hours were cut. She thought it would get better." Daniel closed his eyes, briefly absorbing the implications without needing them spelled out. Complicated. That was the language of board meetings and legal reviews, not the language of survival. He pictured the cost reduction reports again, the applause when margins improved, the congratulatory headlines praising fiscal discipline. He had believed he was strengthening the company. Now he wondered how many unseen cracks had widened beneath the surface. Emily looked up at him, then studying his expression, as if searching for something unspoken. "Are we going to have to leave after today?" she asked quietly. The question carried more than logistics. It carried fear of returning to uncertainty. Daniel glanced at Lily, then back at Emily. The answer he might have given yesterday no longer felt acceptable. Something irreversible had shifted within him during the long night. "No," he said finally, his voice steady but deeper than before. "You are not going back out into the cold." And as the first rays of sunlight touched the edge of the city skyline, Daniel Whitmore understood that the next decisions he made would not be about profit or efficiency. They would be about repair. Morning settled fully over the city, pale sunlight stretching across the hospital floor in long, quiet lines. Lily remained asleep, but stable, her temperature lowering to just under 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The doctor spoke with cautious optimism, explaining that if her body continued responding to antibiotics, she could avoid more serious complications. Daniel listened carefully, absorbing every detail, as if memorizing a balance sheet. Yet this time the numbers felt fragile and human. After the medical team stepped away, he remained beside the window, phone in hand, staring at the name of the subsidiary company on his screen. With a few taps, he accessed internal records, confirming what he had already begun to suspect. Emily and Lily's mother had been employed by a cleaning contractor whose benefits were reduced during his restructuring initiative. Her hours had been cut below the threshold for employer-sponsored insurance. It had been classified as operational efficiency. Daniel felt a heaviness settle into his chest that no amount of wealth could lighten. He looked across the room at Emily, who was gently brushing her sister's hair with slow, protective strokes. She believed he was the man who stopped on the sidewalk. She did not yet know he might also represent the system that failed them. The contrast unsettled him deeply. He stepped closer and crouched slightly so that he was not towering over her. "Emily," he said quietly. "When your mom lost some of her work hours, did anyone explain why?" Emily shook her head. "She said the company changed things. She did not complain. She just worked harder." The innocence of that statement cut deeper than accusation ever could. Daniel nodded slowly, feeling the truth settle into place. This was not charity. This was consequence. He had built policies that looked efficient on paper, but ignored the fragile balance of real lives. The realization did not explode in dramatic revelation. It unfolded quietly like dawn breaking across snow. He could not change the past, but he could decide what came next. He stood and dialed his chief operating officer, ignoring the early hour. When the call connected, his voice carried a steadiness that surprised even him. "We need to review every subcontractor benefit structure immediately," he said. "Effective today." As he ended the call, Daniel understood that the true reckoning was not in the hospital room, but within himself, and the decision forming in his mind would demand more than a single generous gesture. It would require transformation. The morning light did not feel warm. It exposed everything. Lily's breathing had stabilized, but the room carried a fragile stillness, the kind that follows a storm yet still remembers it. Daniel stood beside the hospital bed, staring at the small rise and fall of a 5-year-old child, whose life had narrowed to tubes numbers and careful monitoring, because somewhere along the line, efficiency had mattered more than security. He had spent years believing that leadership required distance, that hard decisions were proof of strength. Now distance felt like abandonment. He walked into the hallway and dialed his chief financial officer, his voice lower than usual, but edged with something sharper. "I want the full report on last year's benefit reductions," he said. "Not summaries, not projections, Names. There was silence on the other end, confusion at the urgency. Daniel ended the call before questions could form. When he returned to the room, Emily was awake, watching him with eyes that seemed older than 9 years. "Are we in trouble?" she asked quietly. The question struck him harder than accusation ever could. Trouble. As if survival required permission. Daniel pulled a chair closer to her and sat down so they were level. "No," he said firmly. "You are not in trouble." He hesitated, feeling the weight of truth pressing against his chest. "Emily, the company your mom worked for was connected to mine." She blinked, processing. Connected how he did not hide behind corporate language. "We made changes to contracts. Some people lost hours, some lost insurance. I signed those changes." The words hung heavy in the room. Emily's fingers tightened around the blanket. "So when Mom said things got complicated, that was you." There was no anger in her voice yet, only confusion and the fragile edge of realization. Daniel felt something inside him crack open. "I did not know her name," he admitted. "I did not know yours. But that does not erase what happened." Silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft rhythm of Lily's monitor. Emily looked at her sister, then back at Daniel. "She kept saying she would fix it," Emily whispered. "She said we just had to get through the winter." The simplicity of that hope devastated him. Daniel leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped tightly. For the first time in his adult life, power felt meaningless. "I cannot change what happened," he said, his voice rough but steady. "But I can change what happens next." And as those words left him, he understood that this was no longer about charity or reputation or obligation. It was about facing the cost of his own decisions and choosing finally to carry it. Emily did not look away from him. The confusion in her eyes slowly sharpened into something more defined, something that carried the quiet weight of betrayal. "You are the reason she lost her insurance," she said softly, not as an accusation, but as a conclusion. Daniel felt the truth settle between them, like a cold front moving through a room. He nodded once, unable to hide behind polished explanations. "I signed the policy changes," he said. "I believed they were necessary. I did not think about who would be standing in the gap afterward." Emily swallowed her gaze, drifting back to Lily's small frame beneath the white hospital blanket. "She worked double shifts," Emily whispered. "She coughed all night sometimes, but she still went to work in the morning. She said if she missed one more day, we might not make rent." Daniel felt his chest tighten with each word. The policies he once described as streamlined and competitive now sounded like dominoes falling in a narrow apartment hallway. "When she got really sick, she said we could not afford the urgent care," Emily continued. "She told me to make soup and keep Lily warm. She promised it would be okay." The simplicity of that promise felt unbearable. Daniel lowered his head briefly, the fluorescent lights above, casting harsh clarity over his regret. He had convinced himself for years that responsibility ended at the balance sheet. Now it extended to a hospital bed, where a 5-year-old lay recovering from a fever that should have been treated days earlier. Emily's voice trembled slightly. "Did you know people like us would get hurt?" she asked. The question was not loud, but it carried more force than any public criticism he had ever faced. Daniel met her eyes fully. "No," he said honestly. "But I should have known that decisions made far away still land somewhere." Silence followed, thick and heavy. For a moment he feared she would ask him to leave. Instead, she wiped at her eyes with the back of her sleeve and said, "If Lily gets better, that is what matters." The grace in that statement humbled him more than anger ever could. Daniel rose slowly and walked to the side of the bed. He did not reach for Lily. He simply stood there, acknowledging the fragile life in front of him. "She will get better," he said quietly. "And I am going to make sure no one else falls through the same cracks." As the words left him, he understood that redemption would not come from a single generous act. It would demand accountability, transparency, and change that reached far beyond this room. And for the first time in his life, Daniel Whitmore was ready to be measured, not by profit, but by repair. The room felt smaller after the truth had been spoken, as if the walls themselves understood the weight of it. Lily shifted slightly in her sleep, her breathing deeper now, more even, and the monitor beside her reflected steady numbers that would have meant nothing to Daniel a day ago, but now felt like a fragile lifeline. Emily remained seated, quiet and watchful, absorbing the reality that the man who carried her sister into warmth had also signed the decision that made warmth unreachable in the first place. Daniel did not defend himself. He did not explain market pressures or shareholder expectations. Those words belonged to a world that suddenly felt distant and hollow. Instead, he moved slowly to the other side of the bed and lowered himself into a kneeling position, not for show, not for sympathy, but because standing felt wrong. From that angle, he was no longer towering over the moment. He was part of it. "Emily," he said softly, his voice steady, but stripped of pride. "You had to be the adult when you should have been a child. That should not have happened." Her eyes glistened, but she held his gaze. "I did what Mom would have done," she replied. The strength in that simple sentence humbled him completely. Daniel looked at Lily again, at the small hand resting against the white sheet, at the faint flush still lingering on her cheeks. "I cannot undo what my decisions cost your family," he said, "but I can accept responsibility for them." The words were not rehearsed. They were raw and deliberate. He pulled his phone from his pocket and opened a message thread with his executive team. With steady fingers, he typed a directive that would reverse the subcontractor benefit cuts, reinstate health coverage, and establish an emergency medical fund for employees and their families. He did not frame it as philanthropy. He labeled it correction. When he pressed send, he felt something shift inside him, a barrier dismantled. Emily watched quietly. "Why now?" she asked. Daniel met her eyes without hesitation. "Because I finally saw who the numbers were attached to." Silence followed, but it was no longer heavy with accusation. It carried the beginning of understanding. Outside the window, the snow had stopped leaving the city, covered in white, untouched and still. Inside the room, Lily stirred and slowly opened her eyes. Her gaze unfocused at first, before settling on her sister. Emily leaned forward immediately, relief breaking across her face. Daniel remained kneeling, witnessing the moment without claiming it. And as Lily's small fingers curled around her sister's, once more Daniel understood that redemption did not begin with forgiveness. It began with facing the cost of one's choices and choosing to change not tomorrow, but now. By late afternoon, the hospital room no longer felt like a crisis center, but a place of recovery. Lily was awake for longer stretches now, sipping small amounts of water through a straw and managing a faint smile when Emily told her that the snow outside looked like powdered sugar. Her temperature had dropped below 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and the doctor spoke with growing confidence about discharge within a few days if progress continued. Daniel stood near the window, watching sunlight reflect off the snow-covered rooftops, knowing that while one battle had been steadied, another had just begun beyond these walls. His phone buzzed repeatedly with responses from executives, some supportive, some alarmed at the scale of the reversals he had ordered. He did not retreat. Instead, he scheduled an emergency board meeting for that evening, determined to present the changes not as optional generosity, but as structural reform. When he returned his attention to the room, he saw Emily helping Lily adjust her blanket with careful hands, the instinct of protection still strong, but no longer desperate. Daniel approached slowly. "The doctor says you are improving," he told Lily gently. She studied him with curious eyes, still pale from exhaustion, but clearer than before. "Are you the man with the warm coat?" she asked softly. Daniel nodded, feeling the simplicity of her question settle over him like grace. "Yes," he answered. "I am." Emily watched the exchange quietly, and for the first time since morning, there was no tension in her posture. There was caution, but also acknowledgement. A social worker entered briefly to discuss temporary housing arrangements, explaining that the hospital could coordinate with local services. Daniel listened carefully, then spoke with calm certainty. "I have arranged a furnished apartment nearby for them, fully paid for the next year," he said. "And I will ensure ongoing support." He did not look at Emily for approval. He offered it as responsibility. The social worker nodded, impressed but professional, and made notes in her file. After she left, silence settled again, but it was no longer heavy. It felt transitional, like the quiet after a storm when roads begin to clear. Daniel understood that restoring benefits and securing housing were not acts of charity. They were steps toward balance. As he watched Emily lean over and whisper something that made Lily giggle softly, he realized that justice was not loud or dramatic. Sometimes it was as simple as making sure a child had warmth medicine and a place to sleep. And for the first time in years, Daniel felt aligned not with power, but with purpose. That evening, while Lily rested under careful observation, Daniel stepped into a quiet conference room the hospital provided and joined the emergency board meeting by video call. The familiar grid of executives filled the screen, their expressions ranging from concern to restrained resistance. He did not ease into the conversation. He explained the subcontractor benefit cuts, the unintended consequences, and the immediate reversal he had ordered. Some questioned the financial impact. Others warned of setting precedent. Daniel listened without interruption, then spoke with a clarity that carried none of his former detachment. "If our profitability depends on families losing access to basic health care, then our model is flawed," he said. "We are not correcting generosity, we are correcting negligence." The room fell silent. For years he had been praised for decisiveness in pursuit of growth. Tonight he was decisive in pursuit of accountability. By the end of the call, a formal vote had passed to reinstate comprehensive benefits for all subcontracted workers tied to his company's properties, along with the establishment of a permanent medical assistance fund. It would cost millions annually. Daniel approved it without hesitation. When he returned to Lily's room, the tension that once defined his posture had softened into resolve. Emily looked up as he entered. "Is it fixed?" she asked carefully, as if the word carried more weight than she intended. Daniel took a seat beside her. "It is being fixed," he replied. "Not just for you, for everyone who was affected." Emily studied him for a long moment, measuring sincerity not through promises but through tone. Lily shifted slightly in her sleep, murmuring something about snow angels. Daniel allowed himself a small smile. "The apartment is ready whenever she is discharged," he added. "It is close to a good elementary school. You will not have to change districts." Emily's eyes widened slightly. Stability. The word lingered between them, even though neither said it aloud. Outside the window, the city lights reflected off melting snow, the storm already beginning to fade into memory. Inside the room, something else was fading as well. The sharp edge of distrust was slowly giving way to cautious hope. Daniel understood that trust would not be rebuilt overnight. It would require consistency, transparency, and time. But as he watched Emily adjust her sister's blanket and then glance back at him with less guarded eyes, he sensed the first fragile threads forming. Justice had begun in paperwork and board votes, but its meaning lived here in the quiet assurance that no child would be left outside in the cold because of a signature made in a distant office. 3 days later, the hospital discharged Lily with a clean bill of cautious optimism, a small prescription bottle in a paper bag, and instructions for rest and follow-up visits. The winter sun shone brightly against freshly cleared sidewalks as Daniel walked beside the sisters toward the waiting car, this time, without urgency, without fear. Lily held Emily's hand with steady fingers. her steps slow but confident, her cheeks no longer flushed with fever. When they reached the apartment building Daniel had arranged, it stood only 6 blocks from the hospital, modest but warm brick, lined and secure. Inside, sunlight filtered through wide windows, touching simple furniture, stocked cabinets, and 2 neatly made beds with soft quilts folded at the foot. Emily stepped cautiously across the threshold, as if uncertain whether comfort could be trusted. Lily walked straight to the bedroom and pressed her hand against the window, smiling at the view of a small park across the street. "There is a swing set," she said softly, her voice filled with wonder rather than weakness. Daniel watched them take in the space, the quiet dignity of having a door that locked a thermostat set to 72 degrees Fahrenheit, a refrigerator humming steadily. He did not present it as charity. He handed Emily a small folder instead. Inside were lease documents in her name, with a guardian co-signer designation under his school enrollment forms already prepared, and confirmation of health coverage reinstated under the revised corporate policy. "This is your home," he said calmly. "No one will change the locks." Emily looked at him, eyes searching for conditions for hidden terms. Finding none, she nodded slowly. Later that afternoon, Daniel returned to his office tower for the first time since the night of the storm. The lobby felt different now, the polished marble reflecting not just ambition, but responsibility. He announced the establishment of the Carter Initiative, named publicly in honor of a former employee whose dedication had gone unseen. The program would guarantee comprehensive benefits, emergency medical grants, and housing stability partnerships across all properties affiliated with his company. Applause filled the boardroom, but Daniel did not mistake it for redemption. Redemption was quieter. It lived in a small apartment 6 blocks away, where 2 sisters unpacked donated winter coats and folded them neatly into a real closet. As evening settled, Daniel stood by his office window and looked out over the city that once felt like a map of assets and liabilities. Now it felt like a network of lives, each one connected in ways he could no longer afford to ignore. And for the first time in years, the power he held felt less like privilege and more like stewardship. 2 weeks later, winter had softened into a gentler season, the snow melting into clear sidewalks and small patches of green returning to the park across from the apartment. Lily's laughter now carried through the open window in the afternoons as she tested her strength on the swing, set her scarf trailing behind her like a banner of recovery. Emily walked her to school each morning, her backpack no longer filled with uncertainty, but with books and carefully packed lunches. Daniel visited often, never announced with cameras or headlines, simply knocking on the door with groceries or paperwork updates. He noticed the small changes first. A drawing taped to the refrigerator with 3 stick figures holding hands. A calendar marked with Lily's follow-up appointments and Emily's spelling tests. Stability was forming in quiet layers. One evening, Daniel joined them for dinner at the small kitchen table, the scent of tomato soup filling the room. Lily insisted on pouring him a glass of water herself, concentrating carefully so it did not spill. Emily watched him differently now, not with suspicion, but with evaluation, as if measuring consistency over time. "You kept your promise," she said quietly. Daniel paused, understanding the weight of those words. "I am going to keep keeping it," he replied. There was no dramatic music, no grand declaration, just 3 people sharing a simple meal under warm light, set to 70 degrees Fahrenheit, a thermostat that no longer felt like a luxury. As the evening settled and the city lights flickered on outside, Daniel realized that transformation was not a single act. It was repetition. It was showing up again and again until trust replaced fear. And in the gentle rhythm of ordinary moments, he felt something he had not known he was missing. Spring arrived fully carrying with it longer days and air that no longer stung the lungs. The park across the street filled with children after school, and Lily now ran toward the swings without hesitation. Her strength restored, her laughter bright and unrestrained. Emily had joined a reading club at school, and proudly showed Daniel her latest library book during his weekly visits. He listened carefully as she summarized each chapter, asking thoughtful questions, not out of obligation, but genuine interest. At the office, the policy changes had begun to ripple outward. Subcontracted employees expressed relief at reinstated benefits, and the newly formed Medical Assistance Fund quietly approved its first round of grants. Daniel did not place his name on the announcements. He allowed the initiative to speak through action rather than publicity. One afternoon, he attended a small community meeting at one of his company's properties, speaking directly with custodial staff and maintenance workers. He heard stories he had never paused to hear before about rent, school fees, aging parents, and unexpected hospital bills. Instead of offering distant assurances, he took notes. Back at the apartment, life continued to settle into routine. Emily no longer checked the door lock twice before bed. Lily slept through the night without coughing. On a mild Saturday morning, the three of them walked to a nearby diner for pancakes. Sunlight reflecting off clean sidewalks where snow once piled high. As they sat in a booth near the window, Lily reached across the table and placed her small hand over Daniel's. There was no speech, no dramatic acknowledgement. Just contact. Daniel looked at the two sisters and understood that change was not measured in headlines or stock prices. It was measured in mornings like this, where fear had been replaced by warmth, and where the future felt open instead of uncertain. By the time summer edged into the city, the memory of that winter night felt distant, yet it remained etched in Daniel's mind with quiet clarity. The apartment no longer looked temporary. It looked lived in. Crayon drawings covered one wall, school certificates were pinned carefully above a small desk, and a pair of bright pink sneakers rested by the door beside Emily's neatly tied laces. Stability had taken root. On a warm evening with the windows open and the air drifting in at 74 degrees Fahrenheit, the three of them sat together on the living room floor, assembling a simple puzzle Lily had chosen from a discount store. The pieces did not fit perfectly at first. They tried again and again. Daniel noticed how Emily guided her sister patiently, never rushing, never giving up. "You stopped that night," Emily said suddenly, her voice calm but deliberate. Daniel looked up from the puzzle piece in his hand. "Yes," he answered quietly. Emily met his eyes, no longer guarded, no longer measuring him against past mistakes. "Thank you for stopping." The words echoed differently now than they had on the sidewalk weeks before. They were no longer a plea. They were acknowledgement. Daniel felt the weight of them settle gently rather than sharply. He understood that stopping had not only saved a child from a freezing night, it had forced him to confront the cost of indifference and to choose responsibility over convenience. Outside, the city moved in its usual rhythm, traffic flowing, lights blinking on one by one. Inside, laughter rose as Lily finally placed the last puzzle piece correctly and clapped her hands in triumph. Daniel watched the two sisters, feeling a quiet certainty settle within him. Wealth had once defined his success. Now presence did. And he knew that sometimes the most powerful decision a person could make was simply to pause, to listen, and to step toward someone in need instead of walking away.